History remembers wars of kings and generals, of borders and flags, but sometimes wars are fought over something smaller, something you can hold in the palm of your hand, a dried flower, a powder, a pipe. In the early 19th century, one empire thrived on industry, steam, and trade, the other on tradition, agriculture, and self-sufficiency. Britain and China, two worlds colliding. And between them flowed opium, a drug that would enslave millions, drain silver from an empire, and give rise to wars that carved humiliation into a nation's memory. This is not just a story about addiction. It is about greed, about power, about the way empires bend morality to their interests. This is the dusty ledger, the Opium Wars. By the late 18th century, Britain had fallen under a spell, the spell of tea. It was no longer a luxury for nobles. It was a daily necessity. From the drawing rooms of London's elite to the crowded alleys of industrial towns, kettles boiled, cups clinked, and tea flowed like water. And it all came from one place, China. The Chinese Empire stood as the world's workshop of wonders. Its silk shimmered in European palaces. Its porcelain gleamed on aristocratic tables. Its tea filled British teapots, morning after morning. But for all their hunger, the British found themselves powerless at the bargaining table, for China wanted nothing in return. To the Qing Dynasty, Britain was a distant, rough-edged kingdom with little worth offering. They dismissed woolens and clocks as inferior curiosities. Only silver, cold, heavy silver, was acceptable in exchange for their goods. And so, ship after ship left Britain's shores laden not with exports, but with treasure. Coins melted into ingots, flowing eastward in a one-way tide. Vaults in London echoed hollow. The East India Company's accountants fretted. Politicians warned of economic imbalance. This silver drain became a national crisis. Britain had built the most advanced industrial economy in the world, and yet here it was, bleeding wealth into the coffers of a foreign power. Whispers spread in London's corridors of power. How long could this continue? The Crown, the merchants, and the company all asked the same question. What could Britain possibly sell that China would buy? It was a question that would unleash consequences far beyond tea tables and trading houses. For in the fields of Bengal, under the searing Indian sun, lay the answer. A flower whose sap could change the fate of empires. Far from the tea houses of London, under a blazing Indian sun, another story was unfolding. One that would tie the fates of Britain and China together in a knot of greed and suffering. After conquering Bengal in the mid-18th century, the East India Company turned the region into its private workshop. Local farmers, once free to grow rice and wheat, now lived under the company's iron rule. They were told what to plant, and what they were told to plant was poppies. The poppy was a beautiful flower, its red and white blooms nodding gently in the wind. But its sap was another matter. Scraped from the pods, dried and pressed into cakes, it became opium, a substance that dulled pain, stilled hunger, and carried with it the promise of escape. The company's system was ruthless. Farmers were forced into contracts they could not refuse. Their land, their seed, their labor, all bent toward a crop that would not feed their families. Hunger spread in Bengal, even as warehouses filled with opium bricks stamped with the company's seal. Every year, tens of thousands of chests were loaded onto British ships, bound for the Chinese coast. Officially, Britain denied trading opium. The East India Company claimed it was simply selling its goods at auction in Calcutta. What happened afterward was no business of theirs. But everyone knew the truth. Smugglers ferried the cargo into Chinese waters, offloading it at secret depots, bribing coastal officials, and slipping it inland, where a hungry market awaited. At first, sales were modest. Opium was illegal in China, after all, banned by imperial decree since the 18th century. But demand grew steadily, year by year. In tea houses and brothels, in merchant villas and military barracks, the drug spread. A pipe here, a pellet there, and soon the company's gamble paid off. For Britain, opium became a miracle trade. The silver once pouring out for tea now poured back in, flowing into British coffers in torrents. The silver drain was reversed. The Crown, the company, and the merchants of London were relieved. But every coin they gained came at a price unseen in London's counting houses: the slow, spreading rot of addiction across the Chinese Empire. At first, opium was a luxury of the privileged, a vice for merchants who had grown wealthy from trade, for scholars who toyed with philosophy late into the night, for nobles who treated it as a fashionable escape. But the pipe's shadow grew quickly. As smugglers widened their networks, the drug filtered downward into the lives of farmers, artisans, and soldiers. In villages, men sold livestock to afford another pellet. In cities, workers spent wages on smoke instead of food. Dens sprang up across the empire. Dim, airless rooms where men sprawled on mats, pipes in hand, lost in dreams that dulled reality's sting. A haze hung over these places, heavy and sweet, the smell of despair. By the early 19th century, the scale of the crisis was staggering. Historians estimate that millions, perhaps 1 in 10 adult men, were regular users. Entire regions were hollowed out. The drug did not just weaken bodies, it weakened the state itself. Soldiers, once drilled and disciplined, stumbled on parade grounds. Some nodded off while standing guard. Reports reached the capital of units too intoxicated to march, let alone fight. Silver, once hoarded in imperial treasuries, now drained away. Families sold heirlooms, farmland, even their children, to pay for the next pipe. The empire's currency collapsed. The Qing court, rooted in Confucian ideals of moral order and discipline, was horrified. Opium was not merely a personal vice, it was a threat to the stability of the realm. Officials submitted petitions to the emperor, warning that the empire's strength was evaporating in smoke. And yet, the trade only grew. Foreign smugglers bribed officials to look the other way. Local mandarins, themselves addicted, chose silence over action. Opium had become more than a problem. It had become an epidemic. And epidemics do not end quietly. Soon, the emperor himself would be forced to act, and his choice of champion, an incorruptible scholar named Lin Shu, would bring the empire into direct collision with the might of Britain. By the 1830s, the Qing court could no longer look away. Reports piled high on the emperor's desk. Villages ruined, soldiers incapable of defending their posts, officials spending more time with pipes than with petitions. Emperor Daoguang was furious. The dynasty that had ruled the Middle Kingdom for nearly 2 centuries now seemed powerless against a foreign poison. His legitimacy, his very mandate of heaven, was being corroded, one pipe at a time. The emperor needed a man he could trust, a man untainted by corruption, unafraid to act. He found him in Lin Shu, a scholar official famed for his honesty and discipline. Lin's reputation was spotless. He was a man of Confucian principle, a believer that the emperor's subjects should live in moral order. He accepted the appointment not as an honor, but as a duty, a fight for the soul of the empire. Lin moved with relentless energy. He drafted impassioned memorials to the throne, warning that opium was a poison more deadly than foreign armies. He called for officials to be punished, addicts to be rehabilitated, and the drug to be eradicated root and branch. When he arrived in Canton in 1839, he acted swiftly. Opium dens were shut down overnight. Smugglers were arrested, their contraband seized. Corrupt officials were dismissed or punished. And then came the act that shook the world. British merchants had anchored thousands of chests of opium off the coast. Lin ordered them handed over, and when the traders refused, he cut off their supplies of food and fresh water until they complied. At last, under pressure, the merchants surrendered. On the beaches of Humen, Lin staged a spectacle of justice. For days, workers toiled, breaking open chest after chest, mixing the opium with lime and salt water. The black paste frothed, dissolved, and ran out to sea. By the end, over 20,000 chests, more than 1,000 tons, had been destroyed. To the Chinese people, it was a righteous victory, a moral cleansing, a sign that the empire would no longer tolerate humiliation. But across the ocean, in London's counting houses and parliament halls, it was seen very differently. The East India Company's profits had been obliterated in a single act. Merchants demanded compensation. Politicians cried that British honor had been insulted. And behind the outrage lurked a deeper calculation. Britain's industrial economy needed China's markets. The opium trade was the lever, and Lin Zexu, in his zeal, had given them the excuse they needed. The stage was set. Smoke and silver had ignited something far deadlier. The Opium War was about to begin. In the summer of 1839, Britain dispatched its warships. Sleek, iron-hulled, and powered by steam, they represented the cutting edge of industrial might. Their cannons could fire farther, faster, and with greater accuracy than anything in the Qing arsenal. China, by contrast, still relied on wooden junks and coastal forts built for a different age. Soldiers carried muskets centuries old. Cannons were immobile, their powder damp, their crews poorly trained. When the two forces met, the result was not battle, but slaughter. At the Pearl River Delta, British guns ripped through Chinese ships in hours. On the open sea, junks splintered and sank beneath broadsides they could not answer. Entire garrisons surrendered without firing a shot. The Qing commanders were stunned. They had believed themselves the Middle Kingdom, the center of civilization. They had dismissed Britain as a barbarian island, and yet here was proof, written in fire and blood, that the balance of power had shifted. Lin Zexu, the man who had dared to defy the opium trade, suddenly found himself blamed for the defeats. Critics at court whispered that his zeal had provoked the foreign barbarians. His memorials went unanswered. At last, in disgrace, he was dismissed from his post. But his removal did nothing to change the tide. The British pressed their advantage, sailing north along China's coast. They threatened Shanghai. They blockaded the Yangtze River, choking off trade and supplies. Civilians bore the brunt. Towns caught in the path of war were shelled into rubble. Refugees fled inland, carrying stories of invincible ships and unstoppable guns. The Qing court faltered. Divisions opened among advisors. Some urged resistance at all costs. Others begged for peace to save what remained of the dynasty's dignity. In 1842, with British troops threatening to march on Nanjing, the emperor chose surrender. The First Opium War was over. But the peace would prove more devastating than the war itself. In August of 1842, aboard the British warship HMS Cornwallis, a delegation of Chinese officials signed a treaty that would change the fate of their empire. The Treaty of Nanking ended the First Opium War, but in truth, it was no peace. It was a humiliation. Its terms cut deep. China was forced to cede Hong Kong Island to Britain, a rocky outpost that would, in time, become a global hub of commerce. 5 ports, Canton, Amoy, Fuzhou, Ningbo, and Shanghai, were pried open to foreign trade, no longer subject to the old Canton system's restrictions. British merchants gained extraterritorial rights. They would be tried not under Chinese law, but their own. And worst of all, China was ordered to pay a massive indemnity, 21 million silver dollars. For the Qing Dynasty, the treaty was an unthinkable concession. The emperor had been forced to yield not to another Asian power, but to a foreign empire he had once dismissed as insignificant. To Britain, it was heralded as a triumph of free trade, proof that industrial power and naval might could bend even the proudest civilization to its will. Newspapers in London celebrated victory. Parliament toasted the opening of new markets. But in China, the reaction was grief and rage. Scholars wept openly at the news. Officials spoke of a national shame. The people muttered that their rulers had surrendered the very soul of the empire. And the most bitter irony of all, the treaty did not end the opium trade. It ignored it, left it festering in the shadows, where it continued to grow unchecked. In the years that followed, crates of opium flowed through the newly opened ports with even greater ease. Addiction spread wider. Silver bled faster. The Treaty of Nanking had promised peace. Instead, it marked the beginning of what Chinese history would call the century of humiliation. A century in which foreign powers would carve away at China's sovereignty, piece by piece, under the guise of trade, diplomacy, and law. And though the ink was dry, the resentment it unleashed was only beginning to burn. The years after the Treaty of Nanking brought no relief. They brought only deeper wounds. Opium imports soared. By the 1850s, more than 70,000 chests a year poured into China, enough to intoxicate millions. The trade was no longer a hidden vice. It was an open flood, drowning whole provinces in smoke. In villages, the consequences were devastating. Farmers who once grew rice and millet abandoned their fields, spending their days in drug dens. Husbands sold family heirlooms to afford another pellet. Mothers pawned jewelry, even children, to keep addiction alive. Silver, the empire's lifeblood, drained out faster than ever. The treasury shrank. Coins grew scarce. Prices soared. And with famine already a constant threat, the added weight of economic collapse pushed communities into ruin. The military was hollowed out. Reports reached the capital of battalions too weak to march, of garrisons where officers and soldiers alike spent evenings in a haze. When rebellions flared, the empire struggled to muster effective resistance. And rebellions did flare. The Taiping Rebellion, born in the 1850s, was fueled by desperation, hunger, and fury at a dynasty that seemed incapable of protecting its people. Led by a man who claimed to be the brother of Jesus Christ, the Taiping movement would engulf southern China in one of the bloodiest civil wars in human history, costing more than 20 million lives. Foreign powers circled like vultures. France pressed for new trading rights. The United States negotiated treaties of its own. Russia advanced from the north. The once mighty Middle Kingdom, the Celestial Empire, was being carved up, its sovereignty chipped away by gunboats and contracts. The Qing court grew paralyzed. Officials argued endlessly. Some demanded modernization, others clung to tradition. The emperor, trapped in indecision, watched as crisis piled upon crisis. Opium was no longer just a drug. It was the symbol of all that had gone wrong. The corruption of officials, the weakness of armies, the greed of foreigners, the suffering of common people. And once again, it would spark war. For Britain, flush with victory from the First War, was not satisfied. And when a single incident involving a seized ship offered the excuse, they would return, this time with allies, and with fire enough to reach the gates of Beijing itself. In 1856, war returned. It began with a single ship, a Chinese vessel called the Arrow, flying the British flag. When Qing officials boarded it, arrested its crew, and struck down the flag, Britain seized the moment. The Arrow incident, as it came to be known, was less a cause than a pretext. Britain was eager for another chance to pry open China's doors. This time, they would not come alone. France, citing the murder of a missionary, joined as an eager ally. Together, the two European powers unleashed the Second Opium War. The Qing Dynasty was weaker now than it had been in the 1830s. The Taiping Rebellion had already torn the empire apart, bleeding its armies and draining its treasury. Against the combined might of Britain and France, China stood little chance. Gunboats bombarded the coast. Allied troops marched inland, brushing aside ill-equipped defenders. Canton fell quickly, then Tianjin. And when negotiations faltered, the Allies advanced toward the very heart of the empire, Beijing. What followed would sear itself into Chinese memory. In 1860, Anglo-French forces stormed the capital. They did not stop at victory. They plundered and burned the old summer palace, the Yuanmingyuan, a sprawling complex of palaces, gardens, and art, considered one of the greatest treasures of Chinese civilization. For 3 days, flames consumed what centuries had built. Priceless bronzes, scrolls, and jewels were carted away. Statues were smashed, pavilions torched. What was not stolen was destroyed. The destruction was not a random act of pillage. It was deliberate, ordered by Lord Elgin, son of the man who had once removed the Parthenon marbles from Greece. It was meant as punishment, a message to the emperor of what defiance would cost. The emperor fled Beijing in disgrace. The Qing court agreed to the harshest of terms. The treaties of Tianjin and Beijing forced China to open more ports, grant full legalization of the opium trade, and allow foreign legations in the capital itself. Missionaries gained the right to travel and proselytize deep inside the empire. Huge indemnities of silver once again drained the treasury. Britain and France had achieved more than victory. They had shattered the illusion of China's invulnerability. The world's oldest continuous civilization had been humbled, its treasures burned, its sovereignty crippled. And as the smoke of the summer palace drifted over the horizon, the people of China asked, was this still the celestial empire? Or had it become merely a prize for others to carve apart? When the guns fell silent, China was left in ruins. The Opium Wars had not merely been military defeats. They were psychological blows, cultural traumas, economic disasters. Opium, once a vice at the fringes, was now everywhere. Farmers, merchants, soldiers, even officials, all trapped in the haze. It had hollowed out society, leaving millions weakened and dependent. And yet, it remained perfectly legal, protected by the treaties signed under duress. Foreign powers grew ever bolder. Britain and France held the lion's share, but soon Germany, Russia, and even Japan carved out their spheres of influence. The Qing court was forced to sign one unequal treaty after another, ceding land, granting rights, and surrendering revenues. The Middle Kingdom, once the center of the known world, now found itself picked apart by outsiders who saw it not as a civilization to admire, but a market to exploit. For ordinary Chinese, the humiliation was unbearable. Their emperors, once thought to rule by the mandate of heaven, had proven unable to protect them. Their armies, once feared across Asia, had crumbled. Their culture, once the envy of the world, had been desecrated by fire and theft. And yet, from the ashes, something new began to stir. Intellectuals called for reform. Merchants demanded modernization. Soldiers urged the adoption of Western weapons and training. If China was to survive, it would need to change, but change would not come easily. The old guard clung to tradition. The dynasty staggered under rebellion after rebellion. The century that followed would be one of turmoil, the collapse of the Qing, the rise of republics and warlords, and eventually the forging of a new China from the ruins of the old. Even today, the Opium Wars remain more than history in China. They are a wound, a symbol of the dangers of weakness and division, a reminder that complacency can invite exploitation, and that sovereignty, once lost, is not easily regained. In the West, the wars were long remembered as victories for free trade and naval power. But beneath that triumph lay a darker truth, that an empire had forced another nation into addiction, burned its treasures, and claimed it was civilization. The story of the Opium Wars is not only a story of the 19th century, it is a warning, a lesson about greed, arrogance, and the terrible cost when empires collide. The Opium Wars were not simply about tea or silver, not simply about ports and treaties. They were about something far larger, about the collision of worlds. One, an ancient empire certain of its place at the center of civilization. The other, a rising industrial power, driven by commerce, invention, and ambition without limit. When they met, the meeting was not an exchange. It was a rupture, a fracture carved by greed, by smoke, by cannon fire. In Britain, the wars faded quickly into history books, remembered as triumphs of naval might and economic necessity. Ships returned home laden with tea, porcelain, silk, and profits. The empire grew richer, its reach wider. But in China, the memory endured like a scar. The humiliation, the addiction, the burning of palaces, the signing of treaties under duress. Each moment became a stone in the wall of resentment that would shape China's path for generations. And perhaps, in the end, this is the true legacy of the Opium Wars. Not the victories, not the defeats, but the lesson that when trade becomes exploitation, when power silences justice, when profit is valued above human lives, history does not forget. And that, like so many stories we uncover here on the Dusty Ledger, is history's reminder that the past is never truly past. It lingers, written in shadows, waiting to be read.